Welcome to everyone joining us for this month's ECR Wednesday webinar hosted by eLife, the series that aims to give early career researchers a platform to discuss issues important to you and your research career. My name's Emma. I work for the eLife Features team, and today we're discussing some refreshing approaches to evaluating researchers. The webinar will begin with the panelists sharing their stories. Then, in the second half of the webinar, we'll be putting your questions to them. To ask a question, you can type in the question box on the GoToWebinar Functions panel, or you can tweet us, we are at eLife Community, using the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Please also join us on Twitter immediately after the webinar, where we'll be continuing the discussion under the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Finally, I'd just like to let you know that we are recording the webinar and will make it available on YouTube in the near future. Now I'll pass over to Melissa to introduce herself and the panelists.
Hi, thank you, Emma. Welcome again to our ECR Wednesday webinar on refreshing approaches to research evaluation. My name is Melissa Jimrick. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego, and I'm also a member of eLife's Early Career Advisory Group, or the ECAG. And I'd like to give just a quick introduction about eLife and what the ECAG group is before we hand it off to our panelists today. So eLife is a nonprofit organization inspired by research funders, in particular HHMI, the Wellcome Trust, and Max Planck. You might know of eLife as a journal, but eLife is actually involved in many different types of activities to promote science and to improve the culture of how science is done. A unique aspect of eLife is that it's led by real practicing scientists who are most familiar with the challenges faced by researchers, as opposed to more traditional publishers where the people that run it might be quite distant from doing research themselves. And I think eLife's goals are nicely reflected by its mission statement. So I'll just read the mission statement. It's helping scientists accelerate discovery by operating a platform for research communication that encourages and recognizes the most responsible behaviors in science. Again, a major focus here is on how we can change scientific culture for the better. This includes things like a more transparent review process or reducing the burden of the review process on authors and promoting reproducibility, and also, as we'll hear, doing a lot of things to help out early career researchers. Randy Sheckman, eLife's editor-in-chief, captured this nicely. He said, "The impact we cherish is discovery in science." And I think that's really where the focus should be, is on doing good science. But the environment we're in can sometimes lose focus of this. For instance, we may become consumed by what journal we publish in or where we are in the author list. And we'll hear more today from the panelists, I think, about kind of different approaches we can take to this to help ensure that good science remains our primary goal in doing all of this. So from its inception, the community behind eLife, including the research funders who support the journal and the editors and referees who run the peer review process, have been very aware of a lot of the pressures faced by junior investigators. So that's why they've invited a group of early stage scientists from across the life sciences to join the eLife Early Career Advisory Group, also known as the ECAG. This group includes graduate students, postdocs, and junior group leaders from laboratories across the world. And I'm really honored to be part of this group because it's been a really fun group of people to work with and have really exciting discussions about a whole lot of different aspects of the scientific culture in which we live in. And our role has really been to guide eLife to create a more positive publishing experience that will, among other things, help early career researchers receive the recognition they deserve. So we've been involved in a number of activities, notably helping spearhead this webinar series, which we're really excited about as a platform to talk about a lot of the issues that are most important to us as early career researchers. One of my personal motivations for getting involved started really with my interest in ways to make how we do science, especially computational aspects of science, how to make that more transparent and reproducible and useful by taking advantage of different technologies. But along the way, I've also become really, really interested in today's topic of how researchers get evaluated, especially on things like big multidisciplinary projects that I've gotten to be a part of, where you might have dozens of authors, all that should have some way to get credit for what they're doing on these really big projects. I recently survived the search for an independent academic position, and now I'm focusing on things like applying for funding and keeping my job. And so I'm really interested in today's topic after talking to senior colleagues about these different processes that early career researchers need to go through. It's been a little bit frustrating to hear some of the ways that committees evaluate researchers for things like promotion or funding or hiring, which often felt like they're counting lines on your CV rather than focusing on the actual contributions that you make to science. So I'm really excited to hear from our different panelists today about different refreshing approaches that we can take to this topic to make this process more about evaluating the science that someone is doing rather than about things that are maybe less meaningful. So before we get started with the panelists, I think we're going to have a poll question that should come up on the screen. The question is, ideally, how should researchers be assessed? Should it be where I've published is the best indicator of my skills? Maybe alt metrics associated with my publication is the best way? Or a third option, I do other things I should get credit for. So I think you should have a chance to go ahead and fill in your answer to that question. I'll give you a second to do that. Looks like answers are coming in. And while people are filling out the poll question, we'd like to thank the co-hosts for this webinar, eLife, which is an alliance of top research centers in life sciences to support and strengthen European research excellence and be a voice for research in European policy. And looks like maybe some poll answers are still coming in, but I'll go ahead and introduce our first panelist. Is going to be Michelle Linterman, who is a group leader at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge, UK.
Hi, thanks for having me. I thought I would just start by talking a little bit about my own career progression. I'm from New Zealand, and I did my undergraduate degree in New Zealand, and then I moved to Australia to do a PhD, and then from Australia to the UK for a postdoc. And after 5 years of doing a postdoc, I applied for an independent position at the Babraham Institute, and I was successful in that application, and that's where I am now. I'm currently a tenure track group leader and I've been here for 3.5 years. And in 5 years, I'll be assessed. I can apply for tenure. So I guess the question is with researcher evaluation is how do you get to that position? And the truth is you get the job and you actually have no idea how they assessed you and how you got there. So you know, the first thing I had to do was have a discussion with my boss about, okay, so what was it that the interview panel actually looked at when they selected me for this position? And really it came down to two things. The first was a strong track record. Now that is publication, but I should be very clear that I haven't published a first author or last author paper in Nature, Cell or Science. So I have this independent position without having a paper in one of the kind of top 3 journals. I do have a strong publication record, so I've published reasonably regularly, and the work has been reasonably well received by the community, which is reflected in the number of citations that it's received. The other thing that was important for the selection panel was actually the research fit. So what was the proposed research that I wanted to do, and how did that fit into the strategic direction of our research institute? So those were the two main things. And I guess the next thing that I will have to do when I apply for tenure is meet a number of criteria. And at our institute, it's very clear and what you need to do. And it's not just based on generating high impact publications. One of the criteria is to have published high quality publications that have had an impact in your research area. to do innovative research, to be independent, to be able to attract funding for your research. But importantly, one of the criteria is also that you're a good colleague, that you're someone that is actually wanted at the Institute and someone that people would actually like to work with. And because we are funded by the Bioscience and Biotechnology Research Council, it's also important that our research fits within the strategic remit of the BBSRC's funding policy. I guess I would just like to say a few things about how I recruit people to my lab, because the way that I've evaluated PhD students and postdocs coming in has actually had very little to do with publications and more about what they're able to do, what their scientific background is, and ultimately their work ethic and their enthusiasm for research. I think potentially researcher evaluation doesn't simply rely on high impact papers. One thing that I've found to be particularly important in my career is the networks that I've made. People respond really well to you if they know who you are, if they've met you, seen you present at conferences, and they're able to engage in discussions with you. And for me, I think this has been an incredibly important part of people knowing both me and my work. And that sort of networking, I think, is really important for developing your career in the future. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. So we're going to move on to our next panelist, who is Nicolas Le Novere, a senior group leader at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge, UK.
Thank you for inviting me to participate to this webinar. Fair and accurate evaluation of research output is actually a topic close to my heart because I had a fairly convoluted career and was an interdisciplinary scientist from the very beginning. So my thesis involves bioinformatics, molecular phylogeny and structure prediction, and also experimental biology, molecular biology, neuroanatomy, and behavior. And then I decided to learn mathematical modeling, so I moved to the University of Cambridge, and this is where I became involved in the revival of systems biology. I came back to France as a pure dry scientist. And finally, in 2003, I moved to Humble EBI near Cambridge to set up my research group, and I stayed in Cambridge after my 9 years at Humble to move to the Babraham Institute where I am. So over the years, my activity evolved until I had two orthogonal research axes, belonging to different domains of science, so with different cultures. On one side, I try to understand how calcium is used to transmit signals at the level of the neuronal synapse. So this involves interacting with neurobiologists, biochemists, conduct hypothesis-driven research that is published only in journal articles. On the other side, I develop software tools, standards for the whole community of computational system biology. So there, my collaborators are more on the computer science side. And in addition to papers, the output are more databases, control vocabularies, technical specification, etc. So in terms of research evaluation, I was generally extremely lucky to meet a really smart scientists who were able to grasp the different aspects of my work. However, in two occurrences, I actually faced the opposite. At the end of my PhD thesis, I had an interview for a bridging grant with a mouse biologist. And at the time, I had 3 papers as first author, right? But the interview entirely focused on one Nature paper describing a knockout mouse, and on which I was actually in 6th position. But I got the grant. So the other experience is when I tried to come back to France and applied for a CNRS position, there were 3 posts, and they were handled by a panel of mathematicians, and they were given the task of evaluating bioinformaticians. So I presented my project that was a systematic structure prediction of the whole of all the protein in the genome. And the only question at the end was, but what new mathematical method will you develop? and which theorem will you prove? And I didn't get the position. I got another one eventually. So I'm now part of many recruitment grants and evaluation panels at different levels. And I'm not very happy with what I see. So there is a problem of evaluation in molecular and cellular biology, but the problem is even more acute in multidisciplinary sciences, such as systems biology. So our activities include theory, simulations, experiments, data analysis, and that belong to math, physics, computer science, and biology. And often the evaluation is really, really domain specific. So as I said, the research outputs are diverse, not just papers. And what we call articles are actually not just in journals, but in conference proceedings, books, and so on. And nowadays, the evaluation, at least the initial evaluation, is generally made with only a cursory look at the CV. So only the journal name is registered. Even the article citations are not often looked for if they are not already present in the CV. Also, mostly we focus on peer-reviewed articles. A technical specification that has been actually peer-reviewed by hundreds of developers and users doesn't really count because it's not in a journal. And the evaluation of non-scientific activity is rarely taken into account. For instance, knowledge exchange, public engagement, and so on. And to be fair, this type of activities is often omitted from standard CVs or as a secondary position. And finally, even within the articles themselves, of course, mostly first and last positions on paper count. And in systems biology, there are often a large number of authors on papers. On a description of a large-scale analysis, not everyone can be first or can be last. And unfortunately, on multidisciplinary studies, bioinformaticians are rarely first or last because their activity is seen as technical. And by the way, that's by no means specific to computational biologists. That used to be the case for physiologists, anatomists, statisticians, basically anyone who actually discovered biological insights somehow. So here are a few suggestions for the young researchers among you. So during the research, insist to have the position you deserve on papers and check that you are recognized for all the work you did, not just the work that provided a figure in the final paper. On your CV, in the list of publication, put all the publications, articles, books, thesis, manuscript, technical spec, and so on and so forth, website, software tools, and try to put DOI or similar stable identifier on every type of output so that people can check them. Put the citation count on highly cited papers, download statistics for software tools and access statistics for databases and so on and so forth. Reserve a section of your CV for non-research activity, management of science, training, public engagement, and emphasize the item for which you had a significant impact rather than drowning the reader under the output. And do the same during your job interview, but this should not be more than, let's say, a quarter of length. You want the research to stay the core of your interest. You don't want to give the impression that this is not. And however, I would say balance the wish to do the right thing and the need to do the things right. Be clever and research the members of the evaluation panels beforehand. Put the emphasis on the type of outcome that is most likely to impress them. So in summary, be a bit cynical presenting yourself. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. Great. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Next up, we have Miguel Godino from the Gulbenkian Institute.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being in the webinar, and it's a very interesting subject. So I think my advice has, from the two members of the panels already are overlapping, and I think that a lot of what has been said, I totally agree. I think I would probably talk a bit about my personal career and then go into what I think was important for me as a young scientist trying to get to the next step. So I'm from Portugal. I've done my undergrad studies here in Lisbon, and I applied to a PhD program that was starting here at the Gulbenkian Institute that was novel in terms of basing themselves really on the science that you could learn and on the heterogeneity of its candidates. So from very early on, we learned that being among people with diverse backgrounds and diverse interests was part of what our community was about, and to be able to communicate amongst those people was key. And I think that that from very early was fundamental for my career as a whole. Multidisciplinarity, but not only this ability to be able to go as simple as you can to explain other people what you do and what are your interests. So I moved on to do a proper PhD abroad in London and in DNA replication. And I wasn't very successful as a PhD student. I ended up without any published papers, so I wouldn't be a very good candidate for the next step. So I would probably be in the water kind of candidate. Unless there wasn't, so I did have a paper published at the end after I finished my PhD, and the reason why I got into my postdoc position in the US was really because I had a one-on-one interview with my my advisor, and I think that that's another important step in the process, which is that people, scientists overall, obviously they are convinced by published literature, but also by the ability of hearing you and knowing what are your interests and what is your approaches and how do you think in science. So I think the interview part should be part of all selection procedures. And so I did my postdoc with John Cooper for a long time, for 6 years, and then I moved on which turned out to be quite prolific and successful in that respect, and that I managed to hold a substantial CV to go on to my next step, and back in Portugal here at the Gulbenkian Institute, where I'm at for the last 10 years. So there, I think that the important point really was to be part of a community that was being established. So we are quite diverse here, and again, the ability of being able to communicate between people that have different fields of science and the ability to interact with them was key. And because we had this background from past, this was a good entry for my next step. And so as part of the community of this institute right now, I think that I value this ability of being able to communicate and being able to interact with people that have different backgrounds. I think this will be the thing that I'll say for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Miguel. Now we'll hear from Raquel Oliveira, who is a group leader also at the Gulbenkian Institute.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's really a fascinating topic, and I'm really glad to be here and exchange ideas. So a lot of what I had thought of saying was already said. So I think I'll also just give a brief introduction to my background. So I did a PhD here in Portugal, and I was already very focused on the theme of chromosome biology during mitosis. And so part of my PhD, I went abroad to Germany, and it was really good to learn that you could do science in different ways, and was, I think, for me, the first clear indication that moving and being in different places is great for our scientific development. It doesn't necessarily mean that one place is better than the other, but I think just learning how to do things differently was very important. So that really set clear that I needed to go abroad for my postdoc, and I went to Oxford University to work with Kim Naismith, and I always stayed very much in the same field of chromosome biology, particularly during mitosis. And so during my postdoc was really great to. I mean, the lab was a lab that was very focused on one problem, but use different approaches, and that was very good to shape the way of doing science, and was very inspirational to also what I would do as the next step. So one of the things that I could think about what to share with you, my biggest challenges when decided to be a group leader or was trying to apply to be a group leader, I think that the major challenges were definitely not on the CV side, because by that stage there's not much you can do about your CV, right? Either you have it or you don't. And I think the major challenges, and that actually was good that I stayed like a year after having my major paper out and then deciding to actually start applying. So during that year was really important to focus on all these things that we are going to be discussing today, you know, all the things that are really not what is clear on your CV and that really can, you know, make or break your chances of getting a position or not. And I think that these three major things for me were, you know, really decide what kind of institute I want to be in, because there are very different types of institutes, and we need, and this is definitely going to influence our science in the future, right? So if we are in a very medical-oriented institute, for example, this is really going to shape and condition the way you do science. Or I don't know, if you are in institutes that is very theme-focused, that's also going to, you know, condition or shape the way you're going to do science. Or if you are in a very multidisciplinary institute, this is going to open different opportunities and different ways of asking or even viewing your specific problem. So I think that, you know, knowing this is quite important. The second thing that for me was crucial was knowing what is my question, you know, what do I really want to do in the future? And this is definitely very important for the institute to know whether they want to hire you or not, right? So I think it's critical that we have a clear vision, or what do I really want to discover. And then the last thing is, and probably again very important, is what is my unique selling point that I can present myself as someone that, you know, is really the right person to do this work. And this, you know, this goes for job search as it goes for grant writing. I think that they you know, do the criteria and the things that are evaluated are very similar at this stage. Everything that goes beyond, you know, where you publish. I think for that, you know, what really unifies these three things: questions, unique selling point, and what kind of institutes, is really, and that relates with your past, is really focusing on what have you discovered, what have you done that makes you the scientist that you are, and who did you work with, and what technologies did you use. And I think that this was really the major aspects, and having a self-assessment for these three major things were probably my biggest challenges. Then during the actual process, there were very, you know, many positive things that in the end made the Gulbenkian Institute to really, you know, not only recruit me, but also having me the idea that this was the place that I wanted to be. And I'm out of time, so I'm happy to you know, discuss some of those during the question time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Raquel. And finally, we'll move to our last panelist before the discussion starts. So finally, we have Janet M. Shaw. She's a Senior Scientific Officer at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And she's going to talk a little bit about HHMI's mission to advance science by supporting people, not projects.
So thank you, Melissa, and hello to everyone out there in webinar land. As you just heard, I am a working scientist, but most recently I've become a Senior Scientific Officer here at HHMI. And what I wanted to do today was give you a sense of how it is we evaluate scientists when we're running various competitions. So as Melissa said, our goal is to fund the person, not the project. And by that we mean we want to identify scientific thought leaders and pioneering researchers who can think boldly and are willing to take risks in the science that they do. And we do this through a variety of different programs. I'll describe those that I think are most relevant to the group on this webinar, which is the Early Career Scientist. So the longest running mechanism here is the HHMI Investigator Program. And many of you may be familiar with this, but if you're not, I'll just tell you that we have investigators who are both early career and mid-career stage. The window of eligibility can vary depending on the year that we run the competition. But we do select these through regular competitions, I would say approximately once every 3 years. So what we're looking for here are creative scientists who are willing to tackle what we consider difficult research questions that in fact may take years to answer. And we think it's important that to do this, investigators get flexible funding that's not tied to a set of very specific aims like you would normally write in a grant. And we give them 7 years of renewable funding that includes full salary, funding that they can use to support the research itself and a variety of different staff, but that is not tied to a very specific project. So what this model allows is the investigators to take their program where the research leads them. And any of you who've worked in a lab for any amount of time know that what you're studying today may change tomorrow because of something you discover, and suddenly you're off in a new direction. And we want people to be able to do that nimbly. Now, in terms of the early career scientists, we also periodically run grant programs, and there's 2 that I think are most relevant that we've done recently. The first is the Faculty Scholars Program, which was aimed at scientists with somewhere between 4 and 10 years of postdoctoral or post-training experience. And the second was an international program that funds early career scientists who've been in their labs for less than 7 years. And in both cases, these people didn't become, we weren't hiring them by the Institute, but we were giving them generous 5-year grants. And again, the money that we gave them was unrestricted. So although they wrote about the area that they worked in, we weren't going to come back, every year and say, did you complete this aim or did you complete that aim? Again, we wanted to give them the flexibility to be bold and to try something risky. So I guess the real question then is, how do we treat publications when selecting these scientists? I think that's sort of the focus of today's webinar. So when HHMI crafts their applications, we do think about this very carefully. And we try to develop an application that will allow the applicant to sort of distill their scientific accomplishments and describe their approach to studying or solving an important biological problem. When it comes to publications, we don't count papers. Instead, we ask applicants to pick 3 to 5 papers, depending on their career stage and the type of program we're running, that they think documents their most important scientific contributions and discoveries, with the focus on the last 5 years. The applicant is then asked to write a short statement for each of these in language that is much more accessible than it would be in the abstract of a paper, for example, that summarizes the relevance or significance of these publications. When we're actually doing the reviewing, there's usually 3 phases. And we have experienced scientists who actually spend significant amount of time with each of the applications, paying attention to what the applicant's written about their own work, about their scientific goals, and the direction that they want to take their scientific program. At these and every other step of the process, we also make sure that we have really highly qualified, thoughtful, and critical reviewers with a track record of recognizing creative, cutting-edge work, who aren't just saying, oh, they've published in these glamour journals, as I know Randy likes to call them. And when we give our reviewers instructions, we ask them to evaluate the science itself, not where it's published, and to try and identify the individuals who have the most potential to make groundbreaking contributions in their field. And so, as you can imagine, this is not one size fits all, right? And every reviewer takes a different approach to this when they look at an application. And my experience in talking to people is that people look at different parts of the application first. So are they going to look at your papers? Absolutely, and they're going to read them. But when they look at these little paragraphs that you write about the research, they're looking for how you think about the work that you've done and why it was important, and what you're doing that makes you different from everyone else in the field. And so I think that sort of gives you, in a nutshell, what we're about. I'm happy to take any questions, and I have to say I've been listening to all of the other panel members, and I think they're giving you great advice for the kinds of things you should be focusing on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Janet. I think before we get to our discussion, we just wanted to display the result of the poll question. There we go. So it looks like 67% of participants thought that they do other things that they should get credit for, not just their publications. 33% like the idea of using altmetrics associated with publications to evaluate researchers. Okay, so I think we're now going to move on to the question section of our webinar. Just a reminder, to ask a question, you can either type it in the question box on the GoToWebinar Functions panel, or you can tweet at us at eLife Community using the hashtag ECR Wednesday. And I guess to get started with the question, to open the discussion, do the panelists have any questions for each other that they would like to ask? Don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to start. I can call on someone. Raquel, do you have any questions that you would like to ask the other panelists?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to ask a question that I think my colleague Miguel is probably ready to answer, which is I know for a fact that Miguel was also already involved in being part of panels for recruiting PIs to the Institute. So I would take the opportunity to ask Miguel what did he think about it and what were the positive and negative aspects of the process this Institute used in particular.
Miguel is just in front of me, so sure, I'll pick it up. Okay, so at the Gulbenkian Institute, we had a very interesting approach to recruiting, which has been unusual, I would say. And we were quite proud in the last call that we had for having a specific line on the advertisement that read the following: the CV with publication list should not present numerical indicators such as impact factor, number of citations, or Hirsch factors. Such indices will not be taken into consideration throughout the selection process. Applicants are, however, invited to propose to 3 of their papers they consider special merit, with brief explanation for which was chosen. And this was quite valuable as a guideline. So as a community, we think that, in fact, the discovery should speak for itself, and the scientist should be able to explain what was the fundamental advance that this discovery had. And we focused entirely on this. So the papers, independent where they were published, several people, in fact, didn't even said which journal they were published in. And this was quite interesting that we discussed it on the merits, and and the selection panel was quite collegial. We interviewed a selection of 30 people in a symposium type, and there were 2 panels, and all the participants actually went through each interviewee, and we decided as a community which were the best fits for ourselves, not judging for the best scientists necessarily, because the ones that were good but better fit were the ones that we ended up selecting in the end. So I think that this was a good example that we witnessed here and that we participated at the Gulbenkian Institute.
Great. Miguel, do you have any questions for any of the other panelists?
So I think that we are trying to give advice to people who are starting, and I think that the idea that we should not think about published science is not really what we're saying, I guess. What we're trying to say, obviously we all think that peer-reviewed published science is extremely important, and I think that and obviously this is the basis of what would be known for the community and how it would spread. The type the question that we're really trying to address is how should we value vanity journals or anything like that. And I think that if nowadays with the types of searches that we can do on the web, the type of journal itself should and is mattering less and less. So I guess that what I heard Michelle saying, and very wisely so, as she was trying to recruit people for her own lab, is exactly on that. That how would you, if you see a great publication, would you just not look at it, or would you ignore it, or would you just simply try and probe the person itself? I'm sorry, it was for Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely wouldn't ignore a publication. I mean, I think we have to be very honest, as you are, that as scientists, what we produce mainly are papers. I mean, that is true, and that is our job. So I wouldn't want to say that someone who had a 10-year research career with no papers, I would certainly look at that very differently than someone with a 1-year research career with no papers. But for me, when I'm looking at people's CVs, I'm an immunologist, so a single Nature Immunology paper is not a better indicator of how someone will perform as a postdoc than 5 papers in journals that have an impact factor of 2. I try to evaluate really what their skill set is and what they can bring to the lab. It's not that I ignore the publication or ignore that they may have had a fantastic publication. It's just that that's a small part of the decision-making process for me, and really what they can do and how they would fit within the team is much more important to me than that one fantastic paper.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great. And Janet or Nicola, do you have any questions for the other panelists?
Well, I have a question. You know, I think one thing that you don't realize until you've served on some of these search committees, which is after you actually have your job, is how much time each application gets. And so I wondered if I actually still run a lab, and I've run a lab for more than 20 years, but I think it might be useful for people who are listening to know how much time people have and how important it is to think carefully about how much information you put in and the size. Anyone?
No, I would like to bounce on that because I actually slightly disagree both with Miguel and Michelle. With Michelle, I completely agree with what you said, but it's very domain specific. So I agree entirely that in molecular and cellular biology, we are to publish papers. This is our job. This is not the case in other aspects of science. So we cannot say as scientists our job is to publish articles. There are domains where there are really no publication in the sense of journal articles, which doesn't mean that the other type of output cannot be evaluated and in a unbiased manner. And that brings me to Miguel. I agree with the idea of toning down the vanity journal. The problem of banning numerical indicators is that it puts actually all the emphasis on the vanity journals. Because if you don't put citation index, I'm not talking about impact factors, I'm talking about the impact of a given piece of work. If you don't put citation index for papers, or H index for a scientist, or even better, the M index divided by the number of years you've been in science, what remains is a list of 5 papers. And for instance, at EMBO, it's 5 papers. Often it's 5 papers, no why 5, but and those 5 papers, somebody who has 3 natures and 2 science, and somebody who has 5 bioinformatics or 3 bioinformatics and 2 databases or nucleic acid research, they will be overlooked, despite the fact that in the domain of genomics, for instance, or all bioinformatics, most of the high impact papers, the one that really changed things, were published in bioinformatics or nucleic acid research or similar journal, not in Nature. So bioinformaticians typically will never have a Nature or a Science or a Cell paper in first author. But if we cannot put our impact explicitly, they will be overlooked. And so I guess what I would like to say is that there is also an evaluation is made in several slices, right? You have the first time you are evaluated, whether for a grant or a job, the person will devote a few minutes of their time to your CV, right? Because we will have 200 applicants, and therefore we need to have simple indicators. And of course, after you clearly mention interview steps, when you can actually interact with the people, when people can explain the impact of the work. That's a completely different situation, of course. And there you clearly quickly debunk people who actually published a Nature or a Science, but it was actually I am co-author of a Nature Genetics that was almost never cited. So you have some of those papers slipping through. But I think we need a balance. We need a balance between quickly conveying the fact that we have a strong track record, and we have, of course, to be able to explain why the future research we will do will be great and will actually bring something to the place we are applying to, or to the funding agencies we are asking money from.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to move to a question from the audience. So someone asked, based on a lot of the statements that we've heard, even if publications themselves are not considered the only metric, a lot of times your CV, for instance, where you worked, does seem to be important. And they asked, is a personal interview more likely if the applicant works at a given institute? Or I'll add to that, if you personally know someone at the given institute, how important are these personal connections and how your CV gets viewed? And is that a good or a bad thing? Any opinions on that?
I mean, I can get started on that. I mean, just picking up from your very last point, I think that clearly the knowing people and the personal interactions are very important. And I don't think that should be seen as a bad thing. It is absolutely crucial that people have all kinds of references. And if you're talking about, you know, alternative ways of evaluation, this indirect and personal knowledge is very important. I mean, because again, like that goes with what I was saying. I think that it's very important that the institute, that you really want that institute and that institute really wants you. And a lot of the extra things of evaluation can be both what you've done, but also the way that you interact with people. And I think that someone, I think it was Michelle, that also mentioned about being a good colleague. So that's, I would say, it's, you know, almost as important as what kind of science you produce and what you have been done. Not so much in terms of being a good colleague as being, you know, the party animal that that goes out and is very friendly, but in particular, you know, is this someone that is gonna shape and influence and positively contribute to every other aspects of the institute, like the science of other groups, you know, the PhD program, outreach, and all of these things that are, you know, a whole package of what being a scientist is. It's not just, you know, being in a closed lab and focusing on a single issue. So I think that that's a very good way of gathering information, and obviously it can't be the only way we evaluate people, but I don't see it as a negative aspect that we take that as into account. I don't know, maybe someone disagrees.
I also agree. I think your network is very important, and I think you wouldn't necessarily exclude someone from an institute that you don't know, but if you did know someone and they gave them a positive reference, then that would be a very strong way to advocate for that particular candidate, but it doesn't mean that that's the only way to go forward. But building your network is incredibly important in science, and I think as an early career researcher, you have to take advantage of opportunities to do that.
So one of the advices that I got as a postdoc, and that I think that I still worth thinking about, is to, while you go through your career, you should aim not for the style of publication necessarily, but to get to be known for a specific discovery amongst your peers. Once you are known for something that other people will remember. So who is that person? Oh, that person is the person that discovered this and that. I think that you have a foot on the door in several places. And so this would be amongst your community, but then you would also be known as easily as an applicant to different institutions that you may apply.
Okay, so next question. What types of criteria outside of publications and networking with other scientists end up being important for hiring decisions? Said another way, what are you proud of on your CV that is not directly related to your research output?
So first of all, again, research output is more than publications. But so besides the research output, that is publication, database software, etc., I will say training, experience in training. In particular, if we are talking about hiring a junior group leader or a tenure group leader, the training aspect and the management of science is quite important. So different type, of course, of training if we hire a junior group leader or a tenure group leader. But I think it's quite important for me at least.
And I can add to that. I mean, for our investigators, when they are reviewed after 5 or 7 years, we do want them to be good members of their community, and we do want to see that they're training scientists, actively training scientists, and contributing to their community. It's an important feature of being a scientist.
Here's a question. So would removing journal names from a publication list be a positive step towards more fairly assessing researchers?
That's a very interesting point. I think that one of the things, it would be curious to see that study. I think that one of the things is that that's going to make it difficult that we actually read the paper without knowing which paper it is, unless people would, provide a PDF that is not formatted. And I think it would be definitely a very interesting approach, at least to study, comparatively, what would be the outcome of an evaluation with and without the journal names. I would be curious to see what would be the outcome.
Okay, so here's a question. So what do you do if you're in a situation where you don't have enough publications and you don't have a job at university currently, but you need to work at university to get those publications? How can you sort of overcome that disconnect?
I guess it would depend what kind of job you want. So at which career stage would you be at? I think at certain career stages, that's not an insurmountable problem. I think if you were at the point that you wanted to be an independent scientist, then I think that would be a problem in my field, at least. Perhaps Nicola would have some suggestions in other disciplines.
Well, I mean, you have to produce something. So in the past, I mean, in the field of computational computing science and mathematics, people have actually been working before getting a position. There are famous examples. Of course, most of them are a long time ago, because nowadays it's harder. But if you want to be a pilot on an airline, you need your license, and there's no way around. So it's not a problem of papers, it's a problem of output. If you don't have a past track record at all, you won't get hired. So work in your garage, work in wherever you want, but come with something.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we're going to head on to our final summary now. So if I could just ask each of you to sort of summarize in a minute sort of your main takeaway points and any advice you have for researchers out of there. So we'll start with Miguel. What's your advice?
Well, I think there are several points here throughout that I thought that were pretty useful, and I think I would start from the obvious one, which is that we need published literature in order to evaluate people. I think that it's inevitable because, at least for my own sake, I still believe in the peer review process, and so published papers are fundamental. But definitely we are not going to be only focusing on the papers and where they were published. I would be much more focused on what was the discovery and what was the fundamental advance that this person that I would be looking at did for his field or her field. And I think that this would be the thing that would guide me for choosing this person.
Fantastic. What about you, Raquel? What of your advice?
Yeah, so I actually stole a list of 5 advice for early career scientists that I usually give when I discuss about this, and some relate with our topic and some are a bit beyond. So the one, very briefly, the first one would be to realize that getting a position does take time. So for me in particular, it was about a 2 years process. So it's something that when people are planning their lives is important to realize. And then a very important thing is to use the postdoc time to practice as many skills as we can, going from grant writing, even if it goes with a supervisor name, writing papers, even if your supervisor rewrites it completely, supervise other people and get all the skills that you can do. So that you are more confident once you start your own position. So the one that I did focus in Mentor Vision is really find your question and your unique selling points. I think that conceptually these are probably the 2 more important things in terms of self-assessment to really, guide us to the future. The 4th one would be at the early stage. It's very important to make a very clear plan. So I was never a very organized person, but actually it was the first time in my life that I had, all the grants, deadlines, and eligibility criteria line up and really setting up a plan of how to do it. And the last one, but I think this was really crucial for me, is, actively engage in learning all the things that you don't know. And when you start your lab, there are a lot of things. And this goes from, studying in books that are written about lab management, taking lab management courses, and very importantly, ask advice to your colleagues. Like, Miguel, for example, was one of the persons that I was bothering all the time for questions about how does one do this. So a bit off the focus topic, but this will be my 5 advice to early career scientists.
Okay, and Michelle, do you have a quick couple of points?
Sure. I think my take home from this is that you do need to generate tangible outputs from your research, and that's field dependent. But those should be robust scientific outputs that you can build on in the future. And then the other thing is just to make sure that you build your network and use your scientific outputs and communicate those to the wider community in as many ways as you can, so that people know who you are and what you've done.
Fantastic. And Nicola?
Show how you are special. So work on your CV so that it's targeted and different and well written, not a standard one. And something we didn't allude to actually today, work on your cover letters. Cover letters are absolutely crucial for the going through the first time, and we don't need a 3 pages cover letter. We need something that show really why you're special. So, for instance, you have to appear, you have to show a wide interest for science, but not fuzzy. You have to be focused in your work, but not narrow. See where? So work on that.
Fantastic. And finally, Janet, what's your advice?
My advice would be to never stop asking yourself whether what you're doing is the same thing that a number of other people in your field are doing. And this is something at HHMI we call the dilution test. If you weren't in the field, would they continue to make the discoveries that you're making? Or are you doing something that is really pushing the field forward?
Very good.
Melissa, are you able to communicate with us, or are you still having technical problems?
I think I'm back.
Excellent.
Hear me. Sorry about that.
All right, then I'll just pass over to you for the final concluding remarks then.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and this concludes the webinar portion. But we're going to continue questions on Twitter afterwards. So I think the panelists and I will be on Twitter to answer questions. We really appreciate hearing your feedback. So I think everybody's going to get sent a short survey following this event. And with that, we'll conclude and get over to Twitter. So thank you, everyone.